What has been your biggest, I have to get out of here life moment? Story 1. Chechnya in 1995. There were obviously a lot of those moments, but one that stood out was when I was walking back to the apartment block where I was staying and realized the entire block was not only empty, but all of the cars were moved out of the way, and there was a carpet laid out about 20 feet in front of me. I had no idea what was under the carpet or why it was there, but it just felt so suspicious. And of course, my first instinct was to run away. The second I turned around, someone from far away opened fire at me, presumably a sniper, but possibly closer. Then I heard shouting and screaming for men to run and get me. The shouts were distant, and they knew they were not going to be able to capture me. That carpet, I will never forget it. My biggest guess was that they had built a hole under the carpet for people like me to fall into. Then they would capture and torture you or do whatever they wanted. There were lots of dangerous marauders and bandits in Grozny during the war. Story 2. Driving to work one night, we came across a lady whose car had broken down, and we decided to try and be helpful. She lived close by and did not have any family to come pick her up. She told us she needed to stop by the bank if we did not mind, and we agreed. We took her to the bank so she could get $20 out to buy groceries the next day. She seemed down on her luck, and we knew what that was like, so we gave her $20 ourselves, no big deal. She said she had another stop, that she had to tell her friend rent would be late. At this point, it was becoming a hassle, and we were close to being late for work, which I could not risk for a stranger. When we reached her neighborhood, I became very worried. I told her we only had time to drop her off either at her house or at her friend's place, but it was up to her since both were close. She started screaming at us and yelling that we would do anything she demanded. We stopped the car. I looked her in the eyes and said, "You take your things and you get out of my car right now." She tried to leave without taking her stuff, so we would be forced to wait for her. But I told her, "Stop. If you don't take your things, I will literally drive away with them." She grabbed her belongings and got out, and we drove away. Story 3. I am a wedding photographer. One wedding took place at a historical village. It consisted of houses over 100 years old, which had once been disassembled, moved to their current location, then painstakingly reassembled inch by inch in order to preserve this piece of history. The groom's mother was the president of the venue organization. She, of course, was very proud to host her son's wedding at the same place where she volunteered. The wedding was great, laid back, and non-traditional. I even stayed a little longer than scheduled since things were so easy. Things finally started winding down around 11 or so, and everyone was drunk. But they had one thing left in store: lanterns. The kind that you light and then they fly away into the night. Nothing quite as romantic as lanterns. However, alcohol plus floating fire, plus tall trees, plus a historical village was not a recipe for success. While everyone tried to light their lanterns, the groom's mother caught wind of what was happening. She ran out into the village screaming for everyone to stop. Drunk and distracted by the challenge, no one listened. Everyone kept trying to get their lanterns to take off, and one finally did. Straight into a lush tree that sprawled out approximately 20 feet above the village. That was when I thought it would be a good idea to leave. The lantern was stuck between some branches, burning fiercely. The groom's mother was literally crying as she watched what she thought would be her beloved historical village going up in flames. As I walked out, I saw the lantern narrowly drift through an opening in the branches and fly off into the distance. Story 4. I was visiting my girlfriend who lived in another country. We had been dating for a few months after I met her on vacation there. Things were rocky in the long-distance relationship, and I was really unsure about it since she was showing signs of being unstable. But she promised that if I visited her, she would show me how much our relationship worked and how good we were together. From the moment I arrived on a Friday evening, she was angry for no clear reason. She kept talking about not having showered because she did not want to please me or something. I genuinely just wanted to spend time with her and see if there was real love there, but that was just the start. On Saturday, we had a good time in the morning, but that quickly changed. When we got home from our activities, she wanted to check my phone because she was convinced I was cheating on her. I gave her my phone and went to take a shower. She kept it quietly for 2 hours and went through everything, sporadically asking me questions like, "Who's Beth?" I answered truthfully and calmly, watching TV to let her do her thing. It was really strange, and I was getting to the point where I wanted to leave. but I could not leave until Sunday, so I just endured it. After those 2 hours, the situation escalated. She started screaming at me for not caring about us. She also had a 3-year-old son who had an accident on the couch and needed a shower while also demanding her attention. She went from screaming at me in the living room to screaming at her son in the bathroom. It was the most uncomfortable and stressful hour of my life. I felt bad for the child and did not want to escalate things because of him. Eventually, her mother came and picked up the boy. While she was outside talking to her mother, I ran to our room, packed my things in a minute, and thought I had to escape as soon as possible. When she came back, she screamed at me for another hour. It was the kind of screaming that made me watch very carefully every time she went into the kitchen, worried she might grab something dangerous. Eventually, she said she was going to a friend's house to think. As soon as she left, I gathered my things, ran out of the house to the nearest train station, and went to another city. I stayed at a hotel and left the next day. I never looked back. That weekend, she revealed who she truly was, and even though it took a long time afterwards, I finally managed to cut all ties. It was awful. Story 5. Halloween 2015, I was standing at a bus stop downtown when I heard yelling coming from down the street. No big deal. It was Halloween. The yelling got louder, so I looked over and saw a man walking toward me with 2 others following behind him. The men behind him were screaming at him while he tried to ignore them. They did not like this, so one of them punched him in the back of the head. He just kept walking. The 2 started getting really aggressive, kicking and shoving him, throwing punches. He did everything he could to avoid a confrontation. He even tried to get on a bus that had pulled up, but the driver closed the door, not wanting trouble near his passengers. Things were getting serious now, and people began noticing and yelling, myself included. The man being followed stood in the street while the other 2 continued screaming and urging each other to attack him more. I was maybe 10 feet away, yelling at them to calm down and asking the guy next to me to call the emergency number. Realizing he was in a bad spot, the man being attacked pulled out a knife, a big knife. I wanted to run, but for some reason I stayed. He stood there, not waving it around, just holding it. The 2 attackers decided it was no big deal, and one of them tackled him to the ground. Everything after that happened quickly. One attacker started kicking him in the head, while the other climbed on top and began punching his face. Finally, the man being attacked had enough and started stabbing the one on top of him repeatedly. A couple of us bystanders rushed in and shoved the attackers off. The man dropped the knife, got up, and ran away. One attacker also ran off. The one who had been stabbed tried to run but collapsed about 10 feet away. I had just wanted to go to the mall to buy a video game, and now I was giving first aid to someone with a massive arm wound and a chest injury. He survived but had a punctured lung. All 3 were eventually arrested. The 2 attackers were charged and pled guilty, so I did not have to testify. The man who was attacked was not charged, though I later heard he had outstanding warrants. It was a crazy day. I did eventually buy that video game and then spent the next few days inside, hiding from the world. Story 6. I was in a funicular in Naples, Italy. It is like a metro or tram that runs up a hill, stopping only at the top and the bottom. At the time, I was an exchange student heading back to my host family's house in the evening. I should note that I do not stand out as a foreigner in Italy. I could pass for a local. I sat down and waited for the ride up. A middle-aged man, a bit heavy and shabby-looking, sat next to me. No problem. I am not exactly a picture of elegance myself. As soon as the funicular started moving, so did the uncomfortable feeling. I could sense the man staring at me, catching glimpses out of the corner of my eye. Soon he was not even subtle anymore. He was blatantly eyeing me up and down. I tried my best to pretend I did not notice. The ride is not fast, so it felt painfully long. When we reached the top, I came up with a plan. Let him leave first and slip away into the crowd. At first it worked. He got up while I pretended to move slowly, then looked back at me and went to the door. But then he stopped, turned around and waited for me. My plan failed. I jumped up, rushed past him, and wove quickly through the exiting crowd. It did not take long before I slipped away through side routes and lost him. As a man, that kind of experience was completely foreign to me. And when I told women about it later, they often said, "Now you know what it feels like." Story 7. In 2004, my parents filed for divorce. My mother worked a traditional 9-to-5 job, and my father worked as a contractor. It was his responsibility to take us to school in the mornings, so my mother would drop my sister and me off before going to work. One morning we were running late because we had managed to hit every red light on the way to my dad's house. Typically, when we were late, my father would stand outside holding a sign that mocked our tardiness. But that day he was not there. Instead, he walked out of the house as we pulled up, came to the window, and handed my mom an envelope. Though the gesture seemed ordinary, something felt wrong. As I turned to say goodbye to my mother, I heard a gunshot. My father had shot her, then fired twice more into her leg. Time seemed to stop. I pulled my sister back into the car, told her to keep her head down, and scream for help. I remember seeing the gun pressed to my mom's head, but it misfired. My father then ran back to the house, turned the gun on himself, and pulled the trigger. At that point, my mom told me she could still drive. My sister crouched in the back footwell while I tried to dial the emergency number. I had wanted to leave as soon as we arrived, but instead I was forced to sit through the entire nightmare. Story 8. When I was 18, I was deceived online but ended up making lifelong friends with two strangers who saved me. This happened more than 10 years ago, and some details are fuzzy, but I remember enough to tell it. In my junior year of high school, I opted for an independent study program so I could finish school from home while working part-time. The trade-off was isolation, so to fill the void, I turned to Yahoo chat rooms. My father had recently bought a webcam, so I set it up and began chatting with random people. A few weeks later, I started talking with someone I will call Pat, who lived nearby and also had a webcam. This was in 2002, and webcams were low quality, but I could see long hair, makeup, and what looked like an attractive figure. To my teenage self, that was exciting. We had average conversations, bonded over music, and things seemed normal. Around Thanksgiving, I had the idea to meet Pat in person. I knew the warnings, but the webcam gave me false confidence. I told my parents I was staying with friends, then drove 2 hours to meet Pat at a college town. After waiting over an hour, Pat finally showed up, clearly drunk, stumbling toward me. The voice was deep, the hands large, and I knew instantly something was wrong. Despite my instincts, I followed Pat and their friends to a huge college party. I tried to hide but could not, and Pat insisted we go to another party nearby. That is where I met Harold and Kumar, two guys who would later save me. At the second party, things became clearer. Pat was sloppy drunk, and when removing a scarf, revealed an obvious feature that confirmed my doubts. I panicked quietly. Harold noticed too, and after going to the bathroom, he came back and whispered urgently, "We need to get out of here." The three of us left immediately. Outside, one of Pat's friends screamed at us as we ran, but we did not look back. Harold and Kumar joked later that they had saved me that night, and honestly they had. Kumar even let me crash at his place and invited me to another party the next day where we hung out with real friends. We still talk to this day, bound by that bizarre but unforgettable night. Story 9. About 3 years ago, I went to a party with two girls I knew. The party was in a really rough area, but I went because one of the girls was very pretty. It turned out to be worse than I imagined. I stood out badly, but surprisingly, the local tough guys seemed to like me, probably because they knew I was not going to cause trouble. The only other white guy there was known as Crazy Craig. He and his pregnant girlfriend were infamous for getting high and starting fights. While I was playing beer pong with a girl, I noticed my blonde friend, who was wearing a leg cast, trying to fight with Craig. Craig was not interested, but his girlfriend stepped in, kicked my friend in the leg cast, and then started stomping on her arm cast. I tried to break it up, but some guy grabbed me and told me, "They are adults. It is not your fight. Mind your business." I wanted to argue, but then I saw Craig pull out a gun and take his shorts off. Now he was standing there completely naked holding a gun. When I shouted that he had a gun, the man holding me spun around, pulled out his own gun, and suddenly about 5 others did the same. That was the moment it hit me. What am I doing here? I liked painting miniatures and playing beer pong, not this chaos. I walked straight out to my car, drove home, turned off my phone, and made a whole new set of friends. Story 10. When my friends and I were sophomores in high school, we were really into skateboarding. One day we decided to grab some drinks at a nearby store. cutting through a neighborhood we rarely went through. We were about 3 minutes away when three guys and a girl came out of a house. One of the guys stumbled, already looking unsteady. They spotted us immediately, and one asked if we wanted to play a game of skate. My friend politely declined, and we kept walking. A few seconds later, they started following us closely. That was when I realized we were about to be jumped. I had heard of kids at my school being attacked and even hospitalized by this group. One of them asked what size board I had. Without thinking, I joked, 6.9. He did not find it funny and immediately got aggressive. We kept walking, tense, as they argued over which of our boards they would take. Suddenly, one of them punched my friend in the face. My friend dropped his board and ran, then the other friend bolted too. I was left alone. Strangely, I was not scared at first. I even started skipping away as if it was a joke. That ended quickly when one of them sprinted up and swung at the back of my head. I turned around, saw his pale face under a black beanie, and finally realized how serious it was. Adrenaline kicked in, and I ran faster than I ever had in my life. I caught up with my friends and we all rushed into the nearest store. The clerk, a big guy, scared off our pursuer. The store manager went outside to confront the group but had a bicycle thrown at him before retreating. Police arrived soon after with multiple squad cars and caught the attackers. It turned out the fourth person was not another guy, but a girl. They were all arrested. After the ordeal, an officer drove us to a safer area, and we ended the day with snacks at a convenience store. Story 11. I went camping with my girlfriend at a hike-in campsite. We brought a small two-person tent. The hike itself was rough, and I ended up carrying everything because she developed mild heat exhaustion, but I managed. That night, after a campfire, we went to bed. A few hours later, we woke up to one of the most violent thunderstorms I had ever experienced. The tent was not built for this kind of weather. As we sat there wondering what to do, we suddenly heard a loud crack that was not thunder. It was a tree splitting and crashing down nearby. For a moment, I was sure we were done for. Luckily, it missed the tent and only damaged some lines, but it left me completely shaken. Once the rain tapered off, I knew we were not staying another night. In the morning, we packed up and hiked back out. We spent the rest of the trip in a hotel. It was by far the scariest camping experience I have had, and I have dealt with bears at campsites before. Bears are nothing compared to that storm. Story 12. I had two moments like that. After I finished my time in the Army, I stayed in Germany for a girl. I found work in a furniture warehouse because it was the only job I could get. I worked hard for 2 years. One of the few advantages was having 30 days of vacation a year, and I spent half of that at a budget resort in Tunisia. The day I came back to work, I remember the crushing feeling of walking into that warehouse. Everywhere I looked, there was endless work. On the shelves, pallets needed to be brought down and sent out. But before you could even get to them, you had to clear out the hall stuffed full of a delivery of chairs. Before you could clear them out, you had to reorganize the hall where the chairs belonged, and so on endlessly. That very day after work, I started looking into ways to go to college. The second moment came after I graduated and moved back to Washington, D.C. to work. I ended up with one of the worst bosses imaginable. She constantly took credit for everything I did and tried to hand off all blame for mistakes to me. I kept myself afloat by insisting everything be communicated through email, which made it harder for her to target me, though she still tried. One day I saw her goals list for the year, and it was entirely composed of goals she had assigned to me. That was the last straw. I applied for and got a transfer back to Germany with the company. 6 months later, the entire North American department was outsourced. Story 13. After reading other people's stories, I realize I have been lucky so far not to be involved in anything too extreme. But there was one moment, not as bad as many others, that still unsettles me. When I was 19, I was traveling late at night by auto rickshaw, a noisy three-wheeler that is a common mode of transport in India. It was around midnight. The driver was a middle-aged man with a large belly, and he started commenting on how handsome I was. I found this strange. A few minutes into the ride, he asked if I had a girlfriend. I said no, and he began smiling in a way that made me very uneasy. Then he told me there was a temple on the way where we could stop, that it was a quiet place to visit at that time of night. Suddenly, my heart started racing, and I began to panic. Thankfully, within a couple of minutes, we passed a traffic police officer. I immediately told the driver to stop, got out, and ran toward the officer. The driver panicked so much that he sped away without even asking for the fare. Story 14. When I was 20 years old, I worked as a line cook in a well-known restaurant in my small hometown. After about a year, I was comfortable with every role in the kitchen and tried to help out co-workers as much as possible. Then a new server started, a man around 30. We had the same name and became casual friends. One snowy night, he asked me for a ride to his apartment a couple of miles away. I agreed. When we got there, he invited me inside for some rare local craft beer. I accepted and went in, where I met his wife. She was very attractive and went to put the kids to bed while he poured the drinks. His wife later returned, handed me the beer in a glass, and I downed 2 strong ones. Soon after, he offered me some weed to mellow out, and again I accepted. By this time I was drunk and started feeling very strange. His wife sat on his lap, rolling joints while we smoked. Then the conversation turned unsettling. He revealed he was part of a fringe Christian group that believed disturbing things, like Santa being the devil, women needing to be beaten, and even hurting himself to prove devotion to his faith. He began saying anyone who was not a believer deserved to die. I tried to remain polite but became extremely uncomfortable. When I stood up to leave, he put his arm around me tightly and started talking about divorce and personal struggles. He was a very large man, and I am thin, so it felt threatening. At that point, I realized something was wrong with the drinks or weed because I felt disoriented and paranoid. His wife had poured my beers in the kitchen out of sight, and I became convinced something had been slipped into them. I pushed him off and tried to head for the door, but he stood in front of it, gripping my arm. My thoughts spiraled into paranoia. I shoved him to the ground, ran out, and left my Jeep in the parking lot because I knew I was too impaired to drive. I kept running until I ended up at a golf course. Somehow, I managed to text a friend incoherently for help. I sat shivering in the snow under some trees until he found me and brought me home. I missed work the next day, and a week later, the man quit and moved away. That night left me deeply shaken. Story 15. I once went away for a short vacation. When I came back, my best friend already had a new group. These friends seemed cool. One was old enough to buy cigarettes. Another always had alcohol to share. At the time, I thought this was amazing. No more sneaking around, no more pretending, no more worrying about being caught. One night they drove by and asked if we wanted to party. Of course, we said yes. At the party, I felt out of place, but everyone seemed friendly. A couple of hours later, I was feeling good and had someone sitting on my lap talking to me and getting close. Then came the moment when we had to make a run for more drinks, and guess who was asked to drive? Alarms went off in my head because I was messed up, and that was the last thing I needed to do. My best friend offered to drive instead. I pulled him aside and begged him not to, but the girl mocked me, calling me a coward, and kissed him in front of me. She said it was my last chance, that she really liked me. The next day, I found out that same group robbed and killed a 64-year-old convenience store clerk. I am now 31 and successful, but I often wonder how messed up my life could have been if I had gone with them. My best friend, who I saw as a brother, went to jail until he was 18 and was in and out of the system afterwards. A few years ago, he called me and talked about the stupid things we did as kids. He said he was glad I did not go that night. I still do not know how he had my number. A week later, I was told he took his own life. It still gets to me every time. Some part of me feels like I did not try hard enough to save him. Story 16. I was 24 and had just spent 7 months living at my parents' house in a rented hospital bed in the family room, while going back and forth to Seattle for reconstructive surgeries on my leg after a car crash. It was my first night back in my own apartment. I was still using a wheelchair, though I could manage short stretches on crutches. My skin had healed enough that it was no longer an infection risk, and my transplanted bone, part from my own body and part donor matrix, was in the process of strengthening. I was told to put about 10% of my weight on it while using crutches to start rebuilding strength. My mom dropped me and my things off at home, and I felt ready to be back with my cats. The first thing I did was wheel myself to the public transit hub half a mile away, ride the train to the stop near my favorite grocery store, restock basic supplies, then treat myself to a nice dinner on a patio with a book. For the first time in months, I felt like a real person again. On my way back home, in the dim evening light, I saw 3 men loitering at a corner. I felt a shiver, the kind of full-body chill that signals danger. Their body language was wrong, and it was a strange place to hang out. I thought about turning back, but the sidewalk was too narrow, and with my leg elevated and bags hanging off the wheelchair, turning around would have been obvious and difficult. I decided my best chance was to pass quietly and hope I was overreacting. Passing them went fine, but soon I realized they were following me, keeping pace about 30 feet behind at a slow speed. When I reached the gate to my apartment complex and started pulling out my key, they rushed me. One pressed a gun less than a foot from my face, another held a knife to my throat, and the third blocked me from behind. I thought, you have no control over whether you live or die right now. The only option is to cooperate and not make them angry. They demanded my wallet and had me retrieve it from my purse. They demanded my ATM pin, warning they would return and kill me if it was wrong or if I called the police. After what felt like an eternity but was only a minute or two, they left. I managed to open the gate and wheel toward my apartment. I stayed calm, planning what to do, but instead of going to my own door, I went to my adoptive uncle and aunt's place 2 doors down. They had moved in recently after I told them about the pet-friendly vacancy. The moment I knocked, I lost control and burst into tears, finally feeling safe. My uncle opened the door just as I choked out gun and gate. He grabbed me inside, yanked in my chair, peeked outside quickly, then was on the phone with the police within seconds. Only then did I truly realize how close I had come to disaster. Story 17. I had been working at the same job for 15 years, the place where I had done my apprenticeship. I had never worked anywhere else, and part of me still felt like I owed them for where I was. The company had grown in orders and turnover, but they refused to expand staff. Everyone was under constant pressure while the directors enjoyed increasing profits. It got to the point where no matter how hard you worked, there simply was not enough time to get everything done. Arriving at 6 in the morning, leaving at 7 at night, and working Saturday mornings became expected, even though it was not contracted and there was no overtime. Everyone was cutting corners to try and keep up, which only led to more mistakes. Stress and anger were constant. You were never thanked when things went right, but when things went wrong, you were blamed. I was told I would not even receive a cost of living pay raise for the 4th year in a row because of mistakes and missed deadlines. I started drinking heavily on weekends and looking back was showing signs of depression. Then I became a father and my wife developed postnatal depression. One morning I was carrying my 3-month-old son into the office in a baby carrier so I could keep working, and a director criticized me for being late. The very next day, I skipped work for an interview. I did not even tell them I was going. I came back to the office just after lunch, interrupted their complaints to answer my phone, and learned I had gotten the new job. I printed and signed my notice within 5 minutes. For the next 2 weeks, they threw money and titles at me, desperate to keep me, but I was already gone. Story 18. I was in a terrible argument with my girlfriend at the time, with whom I was sort of living. We got home, but she would not let it go. I lay down in bed trying to block her out with a pillow over my head. She crawled on top of me, still yelling. Frustrated, I put my hands on her shoulders and shook her lightly, begging her to stop. She smacked me hard across the face. I was stunned. Being in a violent relationship was something I could not tolerate. At that moment, I knew I needed to leave. Without saying a word, I bolted for the door. She did everything she could to stop me, blocking my way, grabbing me. I managed to get out barefoot and ran for my car. She jumped into the passenger seat before I could stop her. I ended up sprinting barefoot down the road toward my mother's house, 3 miles away with her chasing me. After 2 miles, exhausted, she caught up with me. She apologized, and we somehow patched things up. We dated for another year, and while things never got that bad again, I never forgot that moment. Story 19. In August 2016, my city was hosting the state fair. I woke up craving deep-fried cheese curds, so I decided to walk to the fair, buy some, and head home. Nothing else about the fair interested me. What I had forgotten was that a Black Lives Matter protest was planned for that same day. As soon as I stepped out of my apartment, there they were. Hundreds of people chanting, waving signs, even carrying a giant papier-mâché sculpture. They had taken over the highway, with police rerouting traffic. I thought, okay, I can just slip into the back of the protest, weave my way to the front, jog ahead, buy my cheese curds, and find another route home. I stopped at a gas station for coffee and then joined the crowd. But just as I reached the middle, they staged a die-in. At a command, everyone dropped to the ground pretending to be dead. Suddenly, I was the only one standing. Mounted police watched from both ends of the highway. Helicopter blades whirred overhead, and I looked up to see the local news chopper filming everything. I thought, this isn't good. I froze until the protesters got back to their feet, then made my way out of the crowd as quickly as I could. I never made it into the fair for cheese curds, but outside the grounds, some Somali girls had a booth. They gave me naan for free and also handed me a Quran. It was not the day I had planned, but it was one I will never forget. Story 20. 2 for the price of 1. Soon after I moved to Philadelphia, I was biking through North Philly on my way to Temple University. A group of middle-aged men were sitting outside a subway station on Broad Street. One of them shouted, "Nice bike." I said, "Thanks," he replied. "You know, if this were a couple of hours later, I'd steal it." At least he was honest. A few years later, I was in Istanbul by myself, walking along Istiklal Street on a Sunday night, looking for a bar. A man approached me and started speaking Turkish. I told him I did not speak Turkish, and he lit up, asking if I was British or American. When I said American, he started talking about a bar just around the corner with live music. I agreed to follow him, trusting strangers too easily. He led me to what seemed like a normal bar, but then took me upstairs through a giant metal door. Behind it were dozens of women in lingerie. I had heard of this scam before. Drinks charged at outrageous prices, covering a front for prostitution. The manager greeted us warmly and seated women on either side of me. The woman next to me was from Moscow, very attractive. I bought her a drink, planning to leave afterward. The man insisted on getting her a second. During that drink, she misunderstood something I said as asking if her father was in the Russian mafia. She said yes, and then burst into tears. I bought her another drink to calm her down. Then another. After the fourth, I asked for the check. The waiter and the man had a fake exchange in Turkish. The man leaned over and said, "I don't know why the bill is so high. Can you pay your half?" My half was 1,080 lira, about $540 at the time. I handed them my credit card thinking I would cancel it later, but they claimed they did not take cards. Instead, Ahmet would walk me to the ATM. He led me in circles through alleys for 10 minutes before showing me the machine. As I walked past him, I suddenly sprinted away, weaving through crowds for 10 minutes straight. I never went back to Istiklal Street. Story 21. When I was around 10 years old, I was hanging out with a friend just down the street from our apartment building. An older teenager came up and started talking to us. He seemed friendly, but something about him felt wrong. After a few minutes, he said he had something cool in his car he wanted to show us and turned to lead the way. The moment he turned his back, my friend and I looked at each other, silently agreed, and bolted. We ran to my apartment and told my mom, who immediately called the police. An hour later, they caught him. In his car, they found a gun and a couple of knives. He later admitted he had planned to abduct us. Another time, and when I was 12, I was swimming at the lake during summer break. I decided to swim past the beach to explore, since thick brush made it impossible to walk that way. While swimming, 2 older girls approached me and struck up a conversation. They asked my age, and when I answered, they smiled in a way I didn't really understand. When I asked what they meant, they just giggled. I asked their ages, and they told me they were much older than me. Then they invited me back to their campsite. I declined, explaining I was there with my family. But they persisted, insisting it would not take long. Just as I was about to swim away, my uncle called me back to our campsite. The girls let me go. When my uncle asked who they were, I explained, and he told me that their intentions weren't as harmless as I had thought. That was the day I realized not everyone means what they say, and it changed the way I looked at people forever. Story 22. I grew up Mormon, and if you know anything about that faith, you know that when members turn 18, they are expected to leave home for 2 years as missionaries, spending about 15 hours a day knocking on doors to spread their religion. It is presented as a glorious mission for God. With that in mind, I worked jobs throughout high school to save $6,000 to cover the cost of being a missionary. All missionaries begin at the Missionary Training Center in Provo, Utah. My family came with me, and after a brief inspirational message, I was separated from them, not to see or speak with them for the next 2 years. What followed was the most traumatic experience of my life. What was advertised as a joyful spiritual campaign turned out to be a harsh and controlling environment. The missionary training center functioned like a prison, strictly regimented, with every detail of life controlled. Days ran from 5 in the morning until 11 at night, with only one day off per week, which was spent cleaning bathrooms and attending the temple. Sleep deprivation, endless work, and constant indoctrination pushed us into a kind of spiritual delirium where we were vulnerable to any idea. By the second day, I knew I wanted out, but leaving was forbidden. Anyone who left was shamed, shunned, and ostracized by their entire community. I spent 2 weeks devising a plan to escape. Story 23. I was at a birthday party for my friend's crush. There mainly to support him, but also to meet her boyfriend, who had a reputation for being unstable. At the party, I ran into someone I had met a few times before, a girl I will call Amber. Amber was a difficult person to be around, loud, attention-seeking, and often crying for sympathy. During the party, she cried over her ex-boyfriend ignoring her, delaying everyone's plans to leave. Eventually, we ended up at another club, and somehow I found myself separated from my friend and stuck with Amber and 2 others. After some small talk, Amber asked if I was single. I explained that I was on and off with another girl, which was true, though we had been apart for about a month. 20 minutes and a few drinks later, she asked the same question again. This time, without thinking, I said yes. I immediately regretted it. She asked if she could kiss me, and I just froze, staring blankly and trying to decide if I could go through with it. After about 10 seconds, I told her no. She looked crushed, but I actually respected how bold she had been. I said I needed to leave, and she walked me over to find the birthday girl so I could say goodbye before heading out. Story 24. When I was about 18 or 19, my friends and I often hung out in the parking lot of a disc golf course in public park near our homes. We were a group of high school friends, mostly white boys driving trucks, fishing, and playing disc golf, sometimes dabbling in questionable activities out of boredom. It was the late 1990s, and our group was half neo-hippie, half redneck in culture. One evening near dusk, we were hanging around as usual when a large white truck pulled up. 2 men got out and struck up a conversation, saying they were in town to help build a new Walmart nearby. Before long, we were at their extended stay hotel suite, watching dirt bike videos that occasionally cut into unsettling clips with neo-Nazi themes. At one point, someone noticed a book on the coffee table with Nazi symbols. We exchanged glances, realizing something was off. Soon, the men began asking us questions like, "Do you know anything about the swastikas that were spray painted on that church?" We knew the Catholic church nearby had been vandalized days earlier. Immediately, we all silently agreed to get out. Once we left, our group consensus was that these guys were probably undercover officers running a sting. None of us had any connection to racist groups, but the encounter shook us badly. Story 25. This happened when I was studying abroad in China a few years ago. My friend and I, both girls, had gone out partying. We had started the night with a larger group, but by the end it was just the 2 of us, which was pretty normal. We ended up hanging out with 2 local guys we had met at the club. They had booked a table with bottles of liquor and snacks. They offered us drinks, but we declined. I was at the water-only stage of the night, buzzed but not wanting more alcohol. We chatted casually for a while before deciding it was time to leave. The guys insisted on walking us out, which seemed harmless. But when we got into a taxi, they climbed in with us without asking. We told them we were going back to the dorms and gave the driver the directions in Mandarin. The guys, however, spoke to him in the local dialect we could not understand. Soon we realized the taxi was heading in the wrong direction. Panic set in. We begged the driver to stop, to take us to the dorms, or just let us out, but he completely ignored us. It was like we were invisible. The guys suggested we go to an after-party at a massage parlor. We flatly refused. By that point, we were seriously considering jumping out of the moving car. Eventually, the taxi pulled up at a shady place on the edge of town. The guys paid the driver and got out, trying to coax us to follow. We refused to leave the car. Once they were gone, the driver finally took us to the dorms. It was terrifying and clear that he was complicit. Things could have gone so much worse. Story 26. At my old job selling furniture, I sometimes made house calls for design services or to show items to customers too elderly or sick to travel. One day, an older man called and said he wanted a sofa, but could not make the 40-minute trip to the store. I was 23 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, even with shoes on, and determined to make the sale. My co-workers asked if I wanted someone to accompany me, just in case, but I declined. When I arrived, the man could barely walk due to swelling in his feet from diabetes. He looked through my sofa pictures, but then asked me to buy him beer from a corner store. I laughed nervously and refused. After more sofa talk, he suddenly pulled me into a hug. That was not too unusual for a customer, but then he leaned in for a kiss on the cheek and told me he wanted to take me to bed. I immediately stood up, walked out, and left while he pleaded with me to bring him beer. I had never driven that winding country road faster in my life. After that, I never again went alone on a house call to a single man. Story 27. When I was 17, I was in a McDonald's drive-thru with my friend in the passenger seat and his girlfriend in the back. As we were ordering, the car behind us started honking nonstop, trying to rush us. I stuck my head out and told him, "We are ordering, chill out." That set him off. He revved his engine, then slammed into the back of my car. Shocked, I put my car in drive and sped away, but he chased us out of the parking lot. On the road, he swerved ahead, blocked both lanes, and jumped out with a gun in his hand, pointing it at us while yelling. Luckily, no one was behind us. Without thinking, I threw the car in reverse and floored it, pulling some desperate need for speed moves. After about 100 feet, I cranked the wheel and hit the brakes, spinning the car enough to whip it around and escape. We called the police in McDonald's once we got home. The drive-thru cameras had captured his license plate, and he was arrested that same day. Police found meth in his car. That was one of the scariest moments of my life. Story 28. I was at an airport in Costa Rica, about to fly home to the United States. Since there is an exit fee to leave the country, I was waiting in a long, slow-moving line to pay before heading to security. The woman in front of me, who looked European or American, suddenly began glancing around frantically. Then she set down her large bag on the floor and hurried away. Immediately, my mind went to the worst possibilities. I tried following her with my eyes, hoping she was just going to ask an employee something, but she walked all the way down the terminal and disappeared from sight. Unsure of what to do, I asked the people in line around me if they had noticed. They had, but none seemed concerned. I told them I was going to inform someone and went to the nearest employees. In my limited Spanish, I explained what happened, but they seemed unconcerned, almost dismissive. That only heightened my fear. I stepped outside to what I thought was a safe distance and waited, my adrenaline pumping. After about 5 minutes, I saw the woman walking back casually through the glass toward the line. When I rejoined, she was standing there like nothing had happened. I asked her what she was thinking. She explained that she had irritable bowel syndrome and had needed to find a bathroom immediately, apologizing for leaving her bag and expecting us to hold her spot. I was furious. With all the tension and adrenaline still rushing, I told her bluntly how reckless and thoughtless that had been. In an airport, you never abandon a bag and run off. She should have taken it with her and simply started over at the end of the line. Story 29. When I was 21, I was studying computers in college, but lucky enough to land a help desk job at the head office of a major bank. I had money, steady 9 to 5 hours, and enough free time for hobbies and friends. The downside was the office politics, which I hated, and when the department was outsourced, I lost the job. I thought I did not care since I assumed all office jobs were toxic anyway. About a year later, I started working construction, thinking it would suit me better. At first, it was fun not having to care about appearances or formalities, but after 3 years, reality hit hard. I was working 6 to 7 days a week, 13 to 16 hours a day, sometimes not being paid for weeks by my shady boss, often being paid under the table, and living in a cramped basement apartment with mice. My body was sore, my health was poor, and I had lost friends because I was always working. It all hit me on Christmas Eve. I was installing flooring tiles in a new hotel with only my boss there. He was supposed to drop me off after so I could catch a bus to visit my family, but instead he tossed $15 at me and said, "Take a cab, I'm late for a party." He also told me to clean up glue spilled on the 5th floor before I left. Exhausted and alone, I got on my knees to scrub the stain, but the lights went out because the site's generators were on a timer. The only light was from the emergency exit sign and a street lamp outside. That was the moment it sank in. How far I had fallen from wearing pressed khakis and eating steak once a week to being broke, overworked, and missing holidays with my family. I nearly cried. I called a cab and told the driver my story, admitting I only had $15. He gave me the ride for free, as long as I promised not to give up on pulling myself out of that life. I found an overnight job that paid very little, but I also re-enrolled in school using borrowed money. It was exhausting, but I felt better knowing I was moving forward. Before I even graduated, I landed another office job. This time I decided to give the corporate world another chance. 4 years later, I am still there, in a supportive environment, making more than I ever did at the bank. It was a brutal journey, but one I am grateful I did not give up on. Story 30. When I was about 10 years old, I lived near a private lake in southern Texas. One summer afternoon, my friend and I decided to walk barefoot to the lake, about 4 blocks from my house. My street had only one other house besides mine, so it was pretty isolated. As we walked along the ditch, a beat-up SUV drove past us at the intersection. Then it came by again, this time very slowly. A third time I saw it make a sharp U-turn through the trees, heading straight back toward our street. That was when I yelled to my friend to run. We heard the tires screeching as it turned onto the street. Running in the muddy ditch was impossible with all the rocks and sticks, so I grabbed her hand, pulled her onto the asphalt, and we sprinted as fast as we could, yelling at each other to keep going. We had a shortcut through the woods near my house, and she shouted, "Shortcut!" We veered off, crashing through the trees. I heard car doors slam and men shouting behind us. My friend was ahead of me yelling, "Are you coming?" I kept running, terrified. As we reached my house, I could hear the men in the woods yelling things like, "Where'd you go, girls? Let us help you." We bolted inside, slammed the garage door shut, locked the gate, and grabbed the cordless phone. Too scared to call the police, we hid by the window for 2 hours, watching 4 men wander around the woods searching for us. Both of us were cut up badly from the run. She had a gash on her stomach, and I still have a scar on my foot. Our feet were torn up for a week. Even now, thinking about it makes me feel sick to my stomach. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Story 31. When I lived in Atlanta in my late teens and early 20s, I was deep into drugs, weed, coca, ecstasy, and I drank heavily. I was also mixed up with dangerous people. My friends and I would go out targeting undocumented immigrants at bars, luring them outside with the promise of selling them drugs and then robbing them. We started dealing ourselves and soon clashed with another dealer who had sold us bad coca. It escalated into armed confrontations. Guns drawn, shots fired both ways. Somehow, no one was killed, but my life was spiraling into chaos. You would think that would have been enough to make me change, but when you are in that world, it feels like there is no other way to live. What finally broke me was a week-long binge. I loaded up on coca and ecstasy and went without sleep for 7 days. The hallucinations started, first voices calling my name, phantom gunshots, thunder, then visual distortions, flashing lights, moving shadows, walls bending. The paranoia was overwhelming. I locked myself in my room for 2 days, convinced everyone was out to get me. As I was coming down, I had a moment of clarity. I saw my mother sobbing at my funeral. It hit me so hard that I passed out. When I woke up, I swore off coca and ecstasy forever. Within a month, I moved back home to Arkansas. That was almost 10 years ago. Today, I do not smoke, not even cigarettes. I am married with a 2-year-old son, and I am happier than I ever imagined I could be. Story 32. I once took a contract job as a software developer for an airline, and the whole experience felt like stepping into a time capsule. My manager wasn't a bad person, but he was incredibly reserved. What I later learned was called taciturn. On the way to corporate headquarters to get my photo ID, I tried to make small talk, but his answers were limited to yep and nope. The office itself was gloomy. The entrance was tucked into a remote corner of the building, and inside was an anteroom with an unmanned security desk and a phone. For my first few days, I didn't have a card key, so I had to call my manager and wait for him to trudge across the building to let me in. The halls were empty because of recent layoffs, and half the lights had been removed to save money, leaving the place half in shadow. There was an abandoned eating area, lit only by the windows at one end, always eerily dark. Next to it was a row of vending machines in a corridor so narrow you had to turn sideways to retrieve anything. The software was unlike anything I'd ever used. Quirky, outdated, and full of bugs. If you did something in the wrong order, it couldn't be undone. You had to find Bob in the corner, who would type in some obscure command to fix it. Bob was the only one who knew how. The email client looked like a high school Visual Basic project from the 90s, complete with giant green check marks and red X's. You couldn't even delete mail, just move it to a trash folder where it stayed forever. If I asked why things were that way, the only explanation I got was security, usually followed by a shrug and a half smile. Dress code was business casual, with Hawaiian shirt Fridays. Since I already owned a ton of Aloha shirts, I figured it would be a fun way to connect with coworkers. But only one other person wore one. He turned out to be a bass player who spent every summer touring Europe with a German death metal band, which at least gave me one interesting colleague. After 3 weeks of enduring the gloom, the silence, and the bizarre tools, I told my manager I wasn't happy and wouldn't accept a full-time position even if they offered. He just nodded, said I had finished my latest project, and suggested we call it a day. I handed over my card key, walked out, and as I drove away, it felt like I had crawled out from under a massive boulder. Story 33. One time I was tripping on mushrooms at the beach while my friends were higher up on a cliff. I decided to take a trail down onto the sand and swim out to a big rock in the water. I climbed onto it, stretched out in the sun, and admired the barnacles and moss. Then I saw a girl waving at me from shore. I waved back, and she swam out. She told me she was on acid and thought I looked like a mermaid. Excited, I told her I was tripping too, and we could both be mermaids together. We hung out on the rock laughing until her 2 guy friends, also on acid, swam out to join us. They were awkward, invasive, and the conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. The girl began freaking out because our legs were bleeding from climbing the sharp rocks. I decided to head back to shore. One of the guys said he would swim with me. I was already tripping hard and his presence felt suffocating. As I swam, he slipped an arm around my waist and growled in my ear, "Smoking hot." That jolted me. I pushed away, backstroked the rest of the way to shore, and ran back into the woods to find my friends. The trail was hidden, and it took me a while, but eventually I made it. Later, the guy's girlfriend showed up furious, and I convinced my friends we needed to get out of there. To make matters worse, earlier that same day when I was just beginning to trip, the cops had pulled us over. Between that and what happened at the beach, it turned into one of the worst trips I've ever had. Story 34. I was taking the subway home after college one afternoon around 4 o'clock. All the seats were taken, but the rest of the car was fairly empty except for people waiting near the exits. I still had a couple of stops left, so I stood listening to music. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. People around me grew tense and started moving. I looked toward the next car since the train was fully connected and saw a man walking toward a row of seats. I live in a dangerous city, so I immediately pulled out my earphones and moved closer to the exit with the crowd. Just then, a woman in the next car screamed and panic erupted. 2 seconds later, we pulled into a station. I pressed my back against a wall far from the commotion, since the stairwell was jammed with people trying to flee. I ended up near a group of construction workers, which turned out to be a good decision. The man had pulled a gun and was threatening passengers, demanding their phones. Those still seated got trapped as others tried to push out. Eventually, he stepped off the train, chaos spread through the station, and the men shielded me from the worst of it. Police arrived quickly and managed to contain the situation before it escalated further. Later, an older woman looked at me and scolded me for being a coward, saying her friend once got slashed on a bus. Since then, I've hated using the subway. Story 35. One night I was playing darts alone at my regular pool hall. A couple and their friend invited me to join their game, and after a few rounds and a few beers, they asked if I wanted to smoke hookah at their condo. They seemed cool, so I agreed. When we arrived, I noticed plastic covering all the seating, which struck me as odd. We set up the hookah, and as I looked around, I saw a camera on a tripod above the fireplace. My mouth got dry, so I asked for water. The guy said he would get it and walked into the kitchen. Meanwhile, his girlfriend, who had been flirtatious all night, sat right next to me even though there was plenty of space. She pressed her leg against mine, her hand inching closer, while her boyfriend stood in the kitchen, watching us with a strange grin. When he noticed me looking, he turned away, but I also noticed he was stirring my drink with a spoon. I pretended not to see. He returned, set the glass down, and seemed to watch me, waiting for me to take a sip. I faked it, lifting the glass as if drinking, but not actually doing so, then said I needed to grab my cigarettes. Immediately, the atmosphere shifted. He fumbled around for smokes, then blocked the door, telling his girlfriend, "Go get your cigs from the room," in a tone that set me on edge. At that moment, their friend opened the door to come back in, and I bolted, slipping out before anyone could stop me. I didn't care what they thought, I just knew I had to get out. Story 36. Back in college, I went out to a bar with coworkers. We were all resident assistants, celebrating the end of training before the semester started. I only had 2 beers when I suddenly felt extremely drunk, far beyond what made sense. I had been drinking heavily that summer with my other job and knew my limits. Something felt off. I told everyone I needed to go home. The designated driver had stepped out but promised to come back for me. As soon as they left, panic surged. I stood up and said I needed to leave now. My coworkers tried to calm me, urging me to wait. Instead, I yelled at one of them, demanding a ride or I would walk. I could barely stand, but instinct told me I had to get out. That coworker drove me home, with a quick stop at his brother's apartment nearby. By then, I was drifting in and out of consciousness, vomiting and weak. They wanted me to stay at the brother's place, but I insisted on going home. He helped me into my dorm, and I forced myself to vomit more, drink water, and eventually passed out in the shower. Hours later, the original designated driver showed up, keyed into my room, got me out of the shower, and put me in bed. That's when I realized he had stripped down and climbed in with me. I was barely conscious, but I fought him off just enough that he backed down once he realized I wasn't going to pass out completely. Later, I learned he had intercepted mutual friends who had planned to check on me, giving them an excuse to stay away. When I told my friends I was pressing charges, they went pale and admitted his behavior had unsettled them too. The college did nothing. He went on to become a police officer. To this day, I still shake when I remember it. It could have ended so much worse. Story 37. For context, I often found rooms on Craigslist because it was cheaper, and at the time I was living in a townhouse with a few roommates. The place had its issues, but the strangest part was the landlord's obsession with her parrots. They stayed in a cage downstairs and drove everyone crazy, but she adored them. One morning after finals were over, I was finally catching up on sleep while everyone else was at work. Out of nowhere, I heard loud pounding on my door and a man's voice yelling, "Open your door right now!" I didn't recognize the voice, and for a split second I wondered if it was the police, but if it had been, they would have identified themselves. Instead, the shouting grew more aggressive. "Open your door or I'll kick it down." Panic set in. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was this someone trying to rob me, beat me up, or worse? I shouted back, asking who he was and what he wanted, but he just kept repeating the same threat. I tried calling my landlord and my roommates, but no one answered. My body went into fight or flight mode. I had a handgun in a safe, legal with my concealed carry permit, though I never used it unless there was an emergency. I debated pulling the trigger if he came through the door, but I also feared the consequences. Even if it was self-defense, a death could destroy my future. The man then yelled, "You have 10 seconds to open the door, or I'll break it and you'll pay for it." That was the breaking point. I decided my best option was escape. My room was on the 2nd floor, but the drop wasn't too far. I grabbed my wallet, phone and keys, climbed out the window, and lowered myself down carefully before bolting for my car, which luckily wasn't parked right in front of the house. I drove off, shaken. Hours later, my landlord finally returned my call, furious. She explained that she had asked me to watch her parrots while she was out of town. Apparently, their cage had been found open that morning. They hadn't escaped, but she panicked and sent a friend to check on them. That was the man who had pounded on my door. To make matters worse, one of my roommates had told her I was the one who left the cage open, even though I hadn't touched it. She didn't believe me and was more worried about her birds than the fact she had terrified me by sending a stranger who threatened to break into my room. That was the last straw. I immediately found a new room on Craigslist with a proper lock and moved out. It remains one of the scariest situations I've ever been in, and I still believe leaving through the window was the only safe choice.